Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is my Jane Austen July week 4 wrap-up video. I can't believe Jane Austen July is over already. I had such a great month. I read some really great books and I'm going to talk about the 2 that I finished and a few that I'm kind of in the middle of. And then I also have a kind of short stack of Jane Austen related books that I'm going to continue reading because I just didn't have a chance to finish them during the month of July, and I want to read them even though it's no longer Jane Austen July. So first up, I finished Pride and Prejudice. This was a reread for me and I really enjoyed it. I love this story. I feel like this book starts really strong. Chapter 1 is a masterclass in dialogue, I think. The dialogue in chapter 1 between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet is brilliant. The way that Jane Austen reveals character through dialogue is amazing, and kind of the jump start to the plot through their dialogue. I just think that chapter 1 is outstanding. I love how also in chapter 1 at the ball, when she introduces the Bingleys and Darcy and Mr. Hurst, Mr. and Mrs. Hurst, I love how she completely brushes off Mr. Hurst as a character by describing him as just merely looked the gentleman, is what she says, and I think that is so great. I just think that this is an excellently crafted book, but it's also a great story with really interesting characters. The scene near the end between Elizabeth and Lady Catherine is probably my favorite scene in the book. It is just, it's so good. And again, it's the dialogue and what the dialogue reveals of their characters in that scene is just unbelievable. And then also I wanted to mention Mr. Bennet's letter to Mr. Collins near the end is hilarious. I'm just gonna read it because honestly it was so funny. So Mr. Bennet is replying to the letter that he received from Mr. Collins. And Mr. Bennet's letter says this: "Dear Sir, I must trouble you once more for congratulations. Elizabeth will soon be the wife of Mr. Darcy. Console Lady Catherine as well as you can, but if I were you, I would stand by the nephew. He has more to give. Sincerely yours, etc." I just thought that was so brilliant. He just nails Mr. Collins' motives in that really short letter. It is just, it's so good. So yeah, I love Pride and Prejudice. I gave it 5 stars. It was a really great reread and I am really glad that I did read it this month. And then I also finished Pride and Prescience by Carrie, Bebris, or A Truth Universally Acknowledged. This is the first in her Mr. and Mrs. Darcy mystery series. And I loved this story. I always think that, you know, when I come to retellings or sequels of Jane Austen, I'm a little bit leery. You know, some people do it well and other people really don't. But Carrie Bebris knocks it out of the park. So in this book, Carolyn Bingley announces her engagement to an American, shock, at Mr. and Mrs. Darcy's wedding breakfast. The wedding, her wedding, Carolyn Bingley's wedding, is set to happen within weeks, like really fast. So the Darcys put off their trip to Pemberley in order to attend the wedding. But then unusual things start to happen and the Bingleys, the Darcys, the Hursts, and a few others end up at Netherfield, where they become restricted in travel by the weather. So it turns into this great country house, closed circle type of mystery, which I really enjoyed. Now, I have to say that Bebris has an obvious love for Jane Austen. and for Pride and Prejudice, because she recreates that world with ease, and she maintains the characters' personalities. I just thought it was so good. And even Mr. and Mrs. Darcy, the way that they talk to each other, that their dialogue is perfect. And there's a few times in this book where they argue, where they disagree, and it's perfect. It's just brilliant. There was one thing I wanted to note here. It's about Mr. Hurst, and I was just thinking, it's so funny. I really liked kind of the few times when Mr. Hurst is mentioned in Pride and Prejudice. He's just like this character who does nothing and loafs about and does, is just really useless. And so in this book, the rattle of the sherry decanter drew Elizabeth's notice away from her mother's penetrating social insights. Mr. Hurst had dropped the stopper on the floor. As he stooped to pick it up, his hand shook. She observed him with disgust. Were he not a gentleman, he would be considered a drunkard. And I just thought that was so good, so interesting, and totally true of the time period, right? Like, if you were an aristocrat or like high in society, if you were a gentleman, if you were a lady, you got away with so much. I mean, look at, like, Lady Catherine is rude and obnoxious, but she gets away with it because she's Lady Catherine. And so I loved that phrase, that if he were not a gentleman, he would be a drunkard. So yeah, I gave this 4.5 stars. I really liked it, and I am definitely going to continue on with this series. Then there's a few books that I'm still working my way through. I'm still working my way slowly through Jane Austen's England by Roy and Lesley Adkins, Daily Life in the Georgian and Regency periods. I'm reading this slowly, kind of a chapter at a time, and just taking it in, and I'm really enjoying this. I like the way that they write. It's very accessible, and I love that they kind of chose a few people from the time period who left behind diaries or letters, because it really makes it personal, and it makes the period come alive. So I like that they've chosen to write their book that way, and I'm just really enjoying this history of life in Georgian and Regency England. I'm also still making my way through the Watsons and Emma Watson. This is Joan Aiken's attempt to complete Austen's unfinished manuscript, The Watsons. And so I'm very curious to see what Joan Aiken does with this, because I've been reading her sequels to Jane Austen's completed works, and sometimes I like them and sometimes I don't. It's been very hit and miss with Joan Aiken, so I'm very curious to see what she does with this one. And then I just barely started Thomas Love Peacock's Headlong Hall and Nightmare Abbey, but I am not sure I'm smart enough to read to read this book. I don't know, like, I just think that I might not get it. They're satirical novels. The back says they are comic Platonic symposia, where characters who are either representative types or thinly veiled caricatures of Peacock's contemporaries gather in country houses to eat, drink, and discuss. I mean, I had to look up what Platonic symposia meant, and so I mean, that's a reference to Plato, and I don't know anything about Plato. So I'm gonna attempt it, but I am not entirely sure I'm gonna get it. I don't know if I'm smart enough to read this book. And then there's a few novels that I am going to be reading in the upcoming weeks. I have The Jane Austen Society by Natalie Jenner, and this is a post-World War II book set in the village of Chawton, which is where Austen lived, and it's about a group of people who try to start a Jane Austen society. And I also have, the rest of these are from the library. So I have The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, and this is a story apparently of Mary Bennet, which I find interesting. So apparently it starts with kind of Mary's role in Pride and Prejudice, and then it moves past the events of Pride and Prejudice. So I'm very curious to see what Janice Hadlow has for Mary Bennet. I also have Miss Austen by Jill Hornby, and this is apparently a fiction story about Cassandra Austen, who is Jane Austen's sister. I've heard good things about this, and so I'm pretty excited to give this one a try as well. And then for something completely different, I also have Pride and Prejudice and Zombies by Jane Austen and Seth Grahame-Smith. I may not read this in its entirety, but I did want to take a look at it. I think it's pretty hilarious to intermingle a zombie story with Jane Austen's text of Pride and Prejudice, and I'm very curious to see how that works out. And then I have a nonfiction, The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things by Paula Byrne. And this is apparently a biography that explores the forces that shaped the interior life of Jane Austen. Her father's religious faith, her mother's aristocratic pedigree, her eldest brother's adoption, her older brother's naval and military experiences, her relatives in the East and West Indies, her cousin who lived through the trauma of the French Revolution, the family's amateur theatricals, her residence in Bath, her enduring love of the seaside, and her determination throughout her long struggle to become a published author. So that just sounds really interesting. And then finally, I have a retelling of Pride and Prejudice called Unmarriageable by Sonia Kamal. I'm sorry if I didn't say that name correctly. This is Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, which I am very interested to get into and see what happens with this one. And also, I just think that this cover is beautiful. All right, so that is my week for Jane Austen July and my wrap up. I have loved being involved in this read along. Thanks very much to Katie from Books and Things and Marissa from Blatantly Bookish for hosting this event. They've done a great job, and I just had a really good time. I've loved discussing Jane Austen with other booktubers as I've watched their videos and commented, and it's just been a really good time. So, have you read any of these books that are kind of the books that I'm about to read? What were your thoughts of Pride and Prejudice if you read it this month? Have you read Carrie Bebris' historical mystery series? I'd love to chat about any of those things in the comments section down below, and I'll see you for another video soon. Bye.